You have continued violence in the Middle East. You have the IDF fighting against Hamas, continuing to try to stop the rocket barrages, go after Hamas infrastructure, and shoot to stop the threat. That's the basic idea behind what Israel is doing here. Prevent the continued acts of terror, the continued war crimes of Hamas, firing rockets intentionally into civilian areas without any designation of this being a military target whatsoever. They're trying to kill men, women, children, the elderly. Israel will not stand for this. No nation would stand for this. And yet there seems to be some degree of confusion on the left, some degree of moral equivalency that is going on here. Sure, Israel has a right to defend itself, but does it have to defend itself this much? Sure, the Israelis have a right to hit back, but wouldn't things be better off if Hamas was closer, had near military parity with Israel? This is the thinking, the very bad, very wrong thinking of so many on the left these days. Here's an example of saying it out loud on TV, MSNBC's Chris Hayes.
The Iron Dome has worked quite well. Today, some got through. I think two Thai nationals, Israeli, died as a result. But I look at those images and I think, well, good. That's good. I'm glad that those rockets are being intercepted. And also, there's some part of me that's like, can we get an Iron Dome for Gaza? Can the American taxpayer foot the bill to protect innocent children in Gaza, where there's 2 million people in one of the most densely populated parts of the world, so that they don't have death rain down upon them?
Now, I understand that Chris Hayes has no knowledge whatsoever about the military tactics, guns, missiles, anything, but he's paid on TV to share his opinion, so that's what he's doing as a newsman. But the problem is not that Israel has an Iron Dome and Hamas doesn't. The problem is that Israel has to have an Iron Dome because Hamas refuses to live in peace beside the state of Israel, and so Israel must respond with military force to neutralize the threat. And if Hamas was in a position to stop those reprisals from Israel, to stop those counterstrikes, the conflict would only get worse, because then there wouldn't be any consequence, nor would there be any quick way to stop Hamas from firing thousands of rockets into civilian areas as a continued war crime. But there's, on the military side, there's a lot of confusion on the left because many of them just don't know what the heck they're talking about. On the political side of things, you start to see more of the same narrative that's been there in the past, but perhaps a bit louder this time around. They're more clear in how they will speak about it, that somehow the problem of the Palestinians in Gaza is just has a direct correlation to, has some tie to the problem of Ferguson, Missouri and police brutality, or to the American civil rights struggle, or to the fight against white supremacist systemic racism in this country. Major leaps, but they're being made all the time. In fact, comparisons between the Black Lives Matter movement and the situation with the Palestinians of Gaza is explicitly made by some on TV. Here's Rashid Khalidi.
I think that you have changes that are going on. Things like the Tulsa riots, things like Black Lives Matter, are seen as connected by a very large number of people, not just in the Democratic Party, but particularly young people on campuses, young people all over the country. And I think this is something that's actually happening not just in the United States. There's a lot of pushback. There will be even more pushback. But I think people are moving in the direction of understanding that many of these bromides, Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? Israel's security. The most insecure people in Palestine and Israel are Palestinians, and we talk about Israel's security.
So much blather here. Just to take some of the nonsense apart, Israel has a right to defend itself against Palestinian Hamas aggression and attacks. If Hamas didn't attack Israel, there would be no Israel taking military action against Hamas. This is very straightforward, right? But yeah, they try to muddy the waters here, make it seem like it's a much more complicated situation in that regard than it actually is. But then also the connection between BLM and Palestinians. What exactly is that connection? The Israelis have been dealing with multiple efforts for the last 100 years by Arab Muslim states to eradicate them, to annihilate them. The Mufti of Jerusalem was a friend of Hitler and the Nazis, as you recall. There's a very, very nasty history of this region that doesn't often get talked about in the media. But now we're just supposed to believe, because there's some kind of disparity of military arms between the Israelis and Palestinians, there's inherently an injustice being done here. Which society is producing a more decent life, a more just, fair, reasonable outcome for its people? Israel or Gaza and the West Bank? Which society celebrates death, actually has a cult of martyrdom? That would be Palestinian society, not Israeli society. You start to look at what's actually going on over there and why Hamas would be the government, say, of Gaza, and you see that so much of the left-wing rhetoric falls apart with just the lightest touch. All you have to do is see for yourself what's happening. Pay attention to what's going on. And the things that you're told don't make sense anymore. But the left continues to say this. The Democrats in this country believe that there's an oppression, a victimology narrative for the Palestinian people that is absolutely central. Here is Congresswoman Jayapal.
Well, we condemn Hamas's firing of those rockets, but I think you have to look at what prompted even that behavior. I think there was, the continuing annexation that Israel has been undertaking for years, actually. This has been a pattern of action from Israel that frankly has taken away the idea even of a two-state solution, has led to increased hopelessness from the Palestinian people. And I think what Hamas has done is, obviously we condemn that, but we have to look at the power balance here, or imbalance as it were, and we have to put more responsibility on Israel.
What? We have to look at the power balance and put more responsibility on Israel? Israel's more responsible all the time. If Israel took the approach of Hamas, Israel would wipe out all of Gaza, destroy all the buildings, and kill all of the residents there, because that is what Hamas wants to do to Israel. There is inherently greater responsibility being showed by the Israeli IDF and the Israeli government to anything that you would see from Hamas in day-to-day life and in conflicts like this.